Welcome to this Pearls and Irritations podcast. This is a new series of podcasts that we are developing at Pearls and Irritations. I'm John Menadue. I'm the editor-in-chief, and I guess you could call me and my wife the founders of Pearls and Irritations. We seek to provide an alternative to mainstream media, which is facing, I think, serious problems in Australia. In Pearls and Irritations, we've focused on many issues, but some key issues, first of all, of course, is climate change. The second is the relationships between China, the United States and Australia, and all the implications for us in peace and progress in our region. But one issue which we are currently giving prominence to is the tragedy that's unfolding in Palestine, Israel, and particularly in Gaza. And in that discussion about Gaza, it's a pleasure to welcome Margot Reynolds to discuss this issue with us. Margot was a Labor senator for, I think, 15 or 16 years. She came from Queensland. She was a senator from Queensland. She was a minister, two portfolios in the Hawke governments, or two of his governments. Margot has been very active on a whole range of issues, Indigenous affairs. She was a teacher, peace and development issues, gender issues. And in return, or in recognition of that work and background, Margot was awarded in 1963 the senior award in the Order of Australia, Companion of the Order of Australia, for, it said, I repeat, if I could quote, eminent service to the people and Parliament of Australia, to social justice, gender equality, Indigenous rights, local governments, and to the community. And I should also add in friends of the ABC. So, Margaret, welcome to this podcast. On the tragedy that's unfolding in Gaza at the present time, I guess many are disappointed that a Labor government, which back in the Evatt and Tripoli days put so much emphasis on the role of middle powers, the United Nations and various agencies and the various international laws that were developed from that time.
Yes.
Seems that the Albanese government is not so interested in that legacy of Labor governments back to 1945.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, John, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk about what a Labor government should be doing in foreign policy, because I do admire Penny Wong, and I think Penny is trying very hard to retain at least some elements of that legacy from the Evatt, and not just the Evatt, more recently, the work of Gareth Evans, the work of Bob Carr, the work of Paul Keating and Bob Hawke. So I think there is a problem in that the leadership of the party at the moment seem to be more concerned about not being wedged, their word, not mine. They are worried about being wedged by Dutton and the Murdoch press. They're worried about criticism. They're worried about headlines that might be embarrassing to them. And so they're not prepared to speak up for what is right and what is the correct response for a middle power like Australia. It's not a question of taking sides. It's a question of saying international law must always be the priority. We will have war everywhere if we abandon international law. And we've seen it with the United States sort of bungling into various parts of the world because they feel they've got to take revenge. We've seen it most recently with Netanyahu. Yes, it was a terrible attack by Hamas on the Israeli people, but you know we should know by now that military response does not never solves the problem. It makes the problem 10 times, 20 times in terms of the Palestinian people so much worse. And it's not the answer. And that's the sort of message Australia should be giving to both Israel and to the United States, because they are not working according to United Nations principles and the basics of international law. They're just thinking that military might can solve everything. Well, it never has, and it never will.
I think one of the problems, Margot, is that so much of the discussion about this tragedy in Gaza is that there isn't a proper context given to it, that the Palestinians have been suffering, I think as the Secretary General of the UN described it, suffocating occupation for 50 or 60 years. And that is not appreciated.
No.
Why Palestinians feel so angry, frustrated, and and one result was that result of on October 7, which must be deplored, but the context is not properly understood, or choose to ignore
it. I mean, it's the same with the high detention and prosecution rate of Palestinian children. Someone said to me recently, "Oh, but even the children throw stones at the soldiers." Well, there must be something wrong. Why are the soldiers there constantly? Why is Palestinians still, after all these years, living under occupation? And why does the government of the day think that by destroying so much of Gaza, they're going to solve their problem and make themselves more secure in Israel? I mean, it's tragic that people think this way. We have an international law system. We have professional mediators and negotiators. I mean, Qatar has been doing an amazing job to try to negotiate a temporary ceasefire, and they're still trying to negotiate a more permanent ceasefire. There are good people in all countries who can commit to this kind of professional mediation and resolving a crisis, which it is. It is for, the Israeli people. I understand their fear after the attack.
Yeah, Prime Minister Netanyahu keeps telling us that he's got to destroy Hamas.
Yes.
But that is the excuse, isn't it, really?
Yes.
But what his government wants to pursue is to expel Palestinians from Gaza.
Yes.
And I've noticed that there's speculation that there is negotiations with the Egyptians that they would set up a refugee camp across the border from Gaza in Egypt to accept would be probably 1.5, 2 million Palestinians. So whilst Hamas is the excuse, I think the real agenda, if you would agree, is to expel Palestinians from Gaza.
Well, I have heard that there have even been, people in the real estate industry in Israel, planning to take over certain areas of Gaza. I mean, all sorts of rumours spread in tragic times like this. But, it's not unknown that Israel has long wanted to expel the Palestinians. They don't want them there. They don't believe they should be there. And the world community has to stand up and protect them, because this is about colonization and imposing the will of one government on a people. And of course, the country that should understand this very well is Australia.
I think the I saw a figure recently on the occupation that in 1948, Palestinians occupied 94% of the land. Now, Israel occupies 82%
Yeah.
of the land. So that dispossession, occupation has been going on. And unfortunately, most of the world, certainly the Western world, America and others and ourselves, have been standing by and letting that happen year after year after year.
Yes. And look, Australia has to accept responsibility that it has voted down a number of resolutions over the years. But to its credit, and I'm sure Penny Wong was influential here, we did stand up and say that it had to be a ceasefire. We have worked just recently to try to prevent uh, devastation in Rafah. But it's sadly too little too late. And until we say that our priority is not Israel, is not the United States, our priority is international law because we all need it. If every country in the world could behave as the Netanyahu uh, regime has behaved in the last 4 months, it would be.
Coming back to the Labor Party and the Labor government, the Labor Party for years has had a policy for a two-state solution and recognition of Palestine. It seems as if it's almost like a fig leaf. It hasn't done it and uses that excuse time and time again for turning aside from the unfolding occupation of Israel, of the Palestinian lands by Israel.
Well, you would think that now, if ever there was a time to recognise Palestine, it's now. It's nonsense to talk about a two-state solution when Australia hasn't even recognised Palestine officially. We've talked about it. It's Labor Party policy. It's been around for a long, long time. It's time that Penny Wong was allowed to simply announce it.
Do you think a two-state solution is now possible given the occupation, the settlers in Israel of so much of Palestinian land? That is it possible to unfold or reduce or remove those settlers from that land? It seems to me that would be an enormous and a great political problem to resolve.
Look, I think that the international community has to set up some kind of mission in Jerusalem and work with the local people, both on the West Bank and the Israeli government, if they could. But of course, the current government doesn't want to talk to the United Nations or mediators or anyone else. But the only way this could be resolved is with a peacekeeping, independent peacekeeping type of mission to try to work out a reasonable compromise from both perspectives.
Do you think the Australian government would try and lead such an attempt?
Well, I can certainly imagine some of our former foreign ministers and prime ministers having a go at it. And that's what's so disappointing that, you know, at the moment we have a government that wants to hide from anything controversial. We still don't know what Australia's position is on the International Court of Justice ruling on preventing genocide. Our Attorney General, our Prime Minister, they haven't made any comment at all. This is quite outrageous. And I think instead it's going to be Australian civil society that will be taking up the issue to ensure that an Australian perspective is heard in the International Court of Justice.
In the Albanese government hiding, as you say, from this particular tragedy, one of the problems is that so many people now are worried about being accused of anti-Semitism, that their failure to distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel, which is not anti-Semitic,
No,
but that
no.
seems to be
Yeah.
sort of the loaded word that's weaponized to handle or push aside critics of Israel, including our Prime Minister.
Yes. Well, of course, the global community understandably had a huge conscience about the Holocaust and why, you know, why Israel was established when it was and under what circumstances. And we have collectively, you know, that conscience. But, you know, that's also part of the tragedy, not just the tragedy of the Palestinian people. That's, of course, huge. But it is a terrible tragedy for Jewish people that they, of all people, should be being accused of genocide in Palestine. And so, really, it's about looking at individuals who are responsible, governments are elected. This is not talking about the Jewish people or the people of Israel. This is about talking about an out of control government that just only can use warfare to try to get what they see as a solution. So, genuine criticism of government is what we should all do, but this has nothing to do with our relationship and feeling for the people of that country.
One of the problems in addressing this, Margot, has been that our media and governments and others, they've been focusing on the civilian death toll in Ukraine. And we had months and months and months of that dominating our news. But the destruction, the killing, the deaths, civilian deaths and injuries in Gaza is significantly ahead of that in terms of many multiples. But yet somehow our media doesn't want to face up to the fact that we are witnessing a massacre, almost a tragedy in Gaza in real time. We are seeing it actually occurring.
Yes. And of course, the double standard of the West that if certain countries behave in a particular way, they're the public enemy number one, and we all know who they are. But because we expect more of Israel, obviously, and we expect so much more of the United States. But the United States, you know, President Biden wrings his hands and says, "Oh, this is terrible. We should." You know, we want them to stop. But who's supplying the weapons to Israel? And the budget that is just handed over for weapons for Israel is enormous. And so there are a lot of guilty parties. Yes, I guess I would name Netanyahu as the first, but others, including Australia, do in fact have, or they should have, a lot on their conscience.
One thing which the Americans consistently do is talk about a rules-based international order. But we're seeing in the case of Gaza and more particularly Israel and Palestine, there must be dozens of international rules, resolutions by the UN, Human Rights Commission, the International Court of Justice about rules. But in this case in Gaza, we're seeing a classic problem of rules that are being disobeyed wantonly.
Yes.
Despite our talk about a rules-based international order.
Yeah. Well, of course, it's not. It's a US rules-based order, which is what they want. We should always refer to the United Nations rules-based order because that is the real rules-based order. People have been working on that since 1945. There's been a lot of negotiation, a lot of experimentation and discussion and debate and working to persuade people to work on particular conventions and protocols. And it's been going on for all those years. The rules-based order that the US talks about is simply, you know, what they want. I mean, the United States is not very good at signing off on particular United Nations conventions and protocols because they like to be free to do their own thing. So we must always remember that there's only one rules-based order. It's the United Nations rules-based order. And the one that the Americans talk about is just something that they've made up to try to divert attention from real international law.
Margaret, one particular issue is the that we have had disappointments from governments and political parties, that we've seen demonstrations in support of Palestinians across the world, resolutions passed, but not much action has been taken. What is the opportunity, do you think, and how could civil society in Australia respond more effectively to bring an end to this dreadful situation in Gaza, which may even get much worse in the days ahead? What can civil society do you think?
Look, I think our problem is that there are those in civil society who are working so hard, they are devastated by the inaction of our government, the failure of our media to really tell the true story of what is happening. But there are many Australians who simply don't know or don't understand or apparently don't care. I think they would care if they really knew what was happening, but uh, we don't we don't focus on our place in the global community. You know, we're still the lucky country, and if our government has announced tax cuts, I'm afraid I became very disillusioned with all the talk. Tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts. And meanwhile, you know, in Gaza, people are dying, their communities are being destroyed, and all we can talk about is tax cuts. It is very depressing, but uh, in fairness, there are lots of wonderful Australians out on the streets, writing, talking, advocating, ringing their local members, and we need so much more of that.
What do you think that Pearls and Irritations could do further to bring some satisfactory conclusion, peace with justice in this troubled part of the world?
Well, Pearls and Irritations really is Australia's conscience. That's where we read the truth. That's where we find out what we often have not been aware of. And I think Pearls and Irritations acts as the conscience that so many of our parliamentarians have not recognised and not stood firm on in trying to put forth strong resolutions. I mean, the Greens put forward a resolution last week, and only 6 people supported it. It was for a ceasefire, but the Greens put it forward. So, oh no, nobody from either Labor or the coalition would support it. This is childish. This is quite outrageous. The people who are paid good money to represent Australia and to try to prevent the destruction of a different society, they should be ashamed of themselves. They should, if they didn't want it to be seen as a Greens motion, they should have been putting forward one themselves weeks ago.
But Margaret, there must be a lot of members of the Labor, the parliamentary party, who are very concerned about this, but the factions, meaning that in fact they are forced to remain silent, there must be a lot of unease in the party.
Look, there is a lot of unease, and certainly since I was in the Parliament, there's been uh, much more discipline of people like me speaking out. In my day, I can think of dozens of people who would have been marching down to the Prime Minister's door demanding uh, change and a different approach. But these days, I don't know, it's as if it's a bad career move to be critical of your own leader and some ministers. Whereas in actual fact, you need those voices from the community because they're getting phone calls and letters and emails. And, you know, we expect so much more of a Labor government. And there's still time, I think, for a Labor government to speak up, be strong, and challenge both Israel and indeed the United States, because nothing will happen unless the United States acts as well.
Well, thank you, Margot. I think perhaps we might end on that positive note, that we hope that the present government and other parties will respond to this tragedy that's unfolding, that we'll assert ourselves as a middle influential power abiding by international rules to bring justice to this region. So thank you very much from Pearls and Irritations, and also for the kind words that you said about what we're doing. We'll certainly continue on the path that we have been in recent months as the way and bringing to the public our concerns about the serious position and the dreadful plight of the children, the adults in Gaza. I saw recently an article by Gideon Levy in the Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, and he described Gaza as the unchilding of Palestine. That a younger generation is in fact dying.
Yes.
And that tragedy is something which I think must rest with the conscience of everyone.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Margot, for your
Thank you.
time today.